Good afternoon. I want to welcome you here today. I'm sorry we can't be at the museum, but we did have damage at the museum. The damage consists of flooding in the basement, so we have a lot of things upstairs drying. That's why we're not there today. But I think it was last winter, somebody called me and said they wanted to come to the museum and do research. And of course, I told them I could be there. Then that was the day that stormed, so I didn't get in there until 12 o'clock. So these people had already been there, so I gave them a call and I said, well, I'll come in tomorrow, which was a Saturday. I didn't know at that time who they were, that they were related to the Bonrud gangs, but then I asked him if he would do a program, and he immediately said yes. So we're looking forward to this. This is Andrew from Minneapolis?
St. Paul.
St. Paul? And with his mom is here. So I'll turn it over to them.
All right.
And I want to thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. All right. Good morning or afternoon, I guess. Can everybody hear okay and see? Okay. All right. So, yes, my name's Andrew Hasty, and my mom Marie is sitting over here. And you probably, if you just read the little blurb either in the newspaper or whatever about today, and Noble being one of the earlier Norwegian settlers, you probably weren't picturing someone looking like me up here. But I guess I am still Norwegian in spirit, I guess you could say. So, I don't know. Anyways, I do want to say too at the beginning here that I don't claim to be an expert. I'm just sort of self-taught in the genealogy and ancestry thing. I've been working on this for a couple of years now, and so I'm just going to share with you what I know factually. That if there's anyone here too that knows any of the Bonruds or their descendants and wants to write a little thing on the tablets for me, that would be awesome. There's very few living descendants still, so if you have a good story that you want to share or an encounter or something, feel free to put it on the tablets that are at the table. And lastly too, I'm going to send Barb a copy of what I'm going through today, as well as the PowerPoint. And so if you want to get a copy of the PDF or something, you can give the museum a call and she'll be able to send it to you. So, all right. So I'm going to start with my mom began her teaching career in Benson in 1973, and a few days after she arrived in Benson, she got a knock at the door, a woman she didn't know, and proceeded to ask her if she was the daughter of Arlene Wagmer Hasty, at which she said yes, and not sure why. But the woman proceeded to tell her, "Don't let anyone know that you're part of the Bonrud family," and then left. And, you know, she doesn't know anything other than she knows that her grandma is a Bonrud, but after that, didn't really know a whole lot. So she went home on a weekend or something, and then she asked her mother, Arlene, if, you know, she told her about the encounter and then said, you know, why did she say don't mention that you're related to the Bonruds? And my grandmother broke down crying and said never to ask about it. And that was about all she got out of her. And then, I didn't really mention this, but then she went and talked to her dad, who at that point they were divorced, so he filled her in a little bit. But I'm going to flash forward now to 2018, which is when I started my ancestry research. And I knew a few tidbits about the Bonruds. My grandmother, her mother, helped me with an essay in 10th grade English about this box, which is, you can take a look at it later. This is the actual trunk that one of the Bonruds brought over from Norway. My grandmother had stripped it down and was refinishing it, and when she discovered this dark lettering underneath the white paint and learned that it was Nicolina's trunk, actually. And it was originally filled with photos, which I don't know where they went off to, but any case, you can take a look at this later. This has been in our house for many years, I guess. So anyways, I did a story on this, but of course my grandmother did not mention the gang, so I didn't really know a whole lot about that. So, let me. Before I get to Noble, I'm going to go backwards a little bit and talk to you a little bit about the history of the Bonruds. Noble's great-grandparents, Gunder and Karen. Gunder was born on April 28, 1829 in Elverum, Norway, and he married Karen Nilsson Nilsdottir in April of 1858 in Norway. And they had 3 children, Gustav, Karl, and Nora. After the death of his parents, Gunder took his family to America to escape the hardships and poverty in Norway. They arrived in Castle Gardens, in New York in November of 1869, and eventually made their way to Iowa before coming north to Minnesota. And this is a picture of them, as you can see. Not the best looking people. So like many of the Norwegian settlers in the area that came to Lacoparl in the 60s and 70s, Gunder and Karen's parents had made the decision to leave Norway and come to Minnesota, and they bought a small parcel of land in Baxter Township to farm, which you probably can't see from where you're sitting, but anyways, there's a map on your handout. Let's see here. The Bonruds became members at Borgen Lutheran Church, according to church records, in 1877, before transferring to Our Savior's in Baxter. Gunder and Karen lived in Baxter Township until their deaths, Gunder in 1905 and Karen in 1913. As I mentioned earlier, Gunder and Karen had 3 children, Karl, Gustav, and Nora. But I'm going to only be talking about Karl's descendants today. Karl was about 6 or 7 when he came to America, and he was confirmed at Our Savior's in January of 1877. He married the daughter of Johann and Karen Anderson, Caroline Matilda, or she went by Tilly Anderson, in April of 1884. Karl was also a farmer and purchased a large plot of land across the road from his father-in-law's. Karl and Tilly had 13 children between 1885 and 1909. Karen, who went by Carrie, Christina, Melvin, Gilbert, Joseph, Melvina, Amanda, Dora, Casper, Mabel, Elva, Cleon, and Noble. And Amanda is the true middle child, and she's my great-grandmother. Karl was involved very much in church business and church activities at the Baxter Church, and that was a trait that would inspire several of his children to continue being that involved. But sadly, their legacy has been largely forgotten or tarnished due to the events that I will soon speak of. Karl died in 1916 from heart disease, and Tilly and the children were still living at home. They moved into a small house in Montevideo thereafter. And Tilly passed away in 1920 from the influenza. So now I'm going to focus just on Noble. In order to explain the next sequence of events, I'll be focusing on Noble, and he was born February of 1909. Interestingly, which I chuckled at, he's the only one of the 13 kids that was not confirmed at Our Savior's. So, there might be something there. Now imagine what life was like for Noble at the time. He was born the youngest of 13 children on a farm. His father passed away when he was 7. Growing up as a teenager in the 1920s certainly had the splash and splendor of the Roaring '20s. Moving picture shows, electricity, the telephone, automobiles, and a very strong, robust economy. But as we know, the splendor of the 20s was about to undergo rapid declines by the end of 1929. With production declines, unemployment increasing, proliferating consumer debt, agriculture was struggling due to widespread droughts across the country, and falling food and wages. The Bonruds were not wealthy, and they had rented their farmland out to other farmers and lived in a modest house in Montevideo. I don't know the exact location, but if somebody does, I'd love to hear it. So a little bit about the gang now, which is probably why most of you are here. I just want to say too that I believe I can share these stories and whatnot that we've gathered more as entertaining facts now that they won't hurt anyone nowadays, but obviously at the time it was quite hush hush, although it was everywhere. So that's just wanted to say that. By the time the gang began in 1926, Noble was about 17 and was left to his own devices since his mother had recently passed. The first newsworthy article of the time comes to us from the Sioux City Journal on August 3rd, 1926. Dubbed as a miniature Wild West show, George Sturgeon, who's no relation, and brothers Cleon and Noble rode horseback through Dawson on August 2nd and shot out the electric street lamps near the depot. The three were arrested in Montevideo shortly thereafter. Cleon and Noble were fined $25 in damages and charged with disorderly conduct. And I looked it up, that would be about $394 in today's money, just to give you perspective. And this article is also printed in dozens and dozens of Minnesota city newspapers. Hang on a second. Yeah. Between 1928 and 1932, the Bonrud gang now consisted of Cleon and his wife Margaret, Noble, their sister Mabel, and her husband Pearlie, who went by Duco, Oliva, and Walter Christensen, who's not related. Walter met Cleon the first time Cleon was in prison, and that's how they got to be buddies. Cleon and Margaret lived together with Duco and Mabel at 1211 East Franklin Avenue, Minneapolis, which is right near the U of M East Bank and Highway 280, if you know where that is. It's now a parking lot, but. So on a typical night for the Bonrud gang, they'd have a few beers, kidnap a driver and a car, drive to a few fuel stations and depots, and hold up the cashier or pump attendant for the few dollars in coins he would have in his belt coin dispenser. Some nights they would knock off up to 6 stations. Their crimes were notorious throughout the newspapers in the Midwest. However, from what I can find, they held up stations only in Minnesota, Iowa, South Dakota, and then maybe one in Wisconsin that I could find. And again, when I was doing my research too, I should mention that I was really just blown away by how widespread the news coverage was, from all the way up to like Bemidji and Duluth area down to the southern parts of Iowa and all over the Midwest. You wouldn't have been able to avoid hearing about them. So quite prolific. Right before their final spree, Noble married Blanche Goldthorpe in December of '32 in Sioux Falls. So a little bit about their big final spree. It took place on Sunday, February 26th, 1933, at about 6 p.m. when a Minneapolis attorney, Clay W. Johnson, you can see him and his wife up here, they were sitting in their car in front of a drugstore at 40th Street and Lyndale Avenue South in Minneapolis, while his wife was in getting an ice cream cone. And they had just bought this brand new blue Buick the day before. Suddenly, a man got into the front seat and held a gun to Mr. Johnson's ribs and told him to keep silent, while 2 other men climbed into the back seat. He made Johnson drive to a wooded area at Fort Snelling, where they made him get out of the car, blindfolded him and restrained him with rope, and then put him back in the car in the back seat on the ground. When Mrs. Johnson came out of the drugstore and did not see her car, she notified police and the search began at once. Now earlier that evening, Walter Christensen and the Bonrud boys were having some beers at Mabel and Dougal's house in Minneapolis when they decided they were running low on cash and thought they'd go out on another spree. The boys had left the women at the house, but came back and picked them up after they had subdued Mr. Johnson. According to Mr. Johnson, quote, "They occasionally kicked me in the face. They never called each other by name. Several times we stopped and some of them would get out. Then they would jump back in and the car would race away," which would be another holdup somewhere. "And they had a beer party after every holdup." And that was printed in the Minneapolis Star after they were apprehended. This is a street picture of what it looks like today, actually, but it was a drugstore. All right, according to the Minneapolis Star, the party then headed north out of town and held up oil stations in Atwater, Cokato, Wilmer, Litchfield, and Grove City. This was on what they called Highway 10 back then, but it's now Highway 12. After they had committed the robbery in Wilmer, word was sent ahead to the Benson chief to be on his lookout for the bandits. Sheriff C.O. Johnson hid himself at Goggins All-Night Oil Station in Benson. Soon the bandit car drove up. Two men got out and ordered Arnie Strand, the attendant, to hold up his hands as they began to search him and took $2.39. Combined, they took about $10 between the inside cashier and the attendant. Just then, the sheriff approached and began firing. There's a picture of Goggins Station and then Noble. One bullet hit Noble right in the throat and fell dead. The others fled to the car. Walter Christensen was also injured in the gunfire. Sheriff Johnson kept firing his bullets, riddling the car as it hurriedly drove away. Those in the car fired about 10 times at Johnson, but missed him. 4 miles west of Benson, the car went into a ditch after a flat tire. The 6 gang members abandoned Johnson, his car, and 6 pistols. Johnson was eventually able to escape his restraints and ran to a nearby farm. The gang also went to a different nearby farm to commandeer another car. They forced farmer Henry Larson to get his car out and drive them towards Montevideo on what is now Highway 39. But Larson's car ran out of gas, and the party left the car and its driver and went to the home of another farmer, Edward Wayne. They forced him to get out of bed and go get his car and drive them towards Montevideo. But by this time, Sheriff Johnson of Benson had telephoned Sheriff Peterson in Montevideo to warn him that the bandits were probably headed his way. The sheriff and Chief Lars Skunborg made a barricade about 14 miles northeast of Monte between Benson on 39. As the car approached and the bandits saw a heavily armed group, because he'd gotten a bunch of farmers with their pitchforks and everything, there was a big posse of them. They quickly stepped out of the car and they surrendered. They didn't try to fire anymore or anything like that. And that was at about 4 a.m. So when they left Minneapolis, it was around 6 p.m. and now 4 a.m. the next morning. Upon confessing to the kidnappings of Johnson, Larson, and Wayne, the 6 remaining gangsters were held in the Montevideo jail. Which this is a picture of it. It's been renovated to looks like a house now, but that was the jail building. Let's see here. And then by March 2nd, they had confessed to 32 crimes. This is from, as you can see, the headline in the Minneapolis Star paper. We got the sheriff on the left here, and then the car full of bullet holes here on the right. The photos come from the Swift County Monitor also. And here's just a couple more that you can see, the bullet holes, and then this is where the sheriff was hiding off to the side. After confessing to 32, the next day that number increased to 43 crimes. And you can see the 3 men there, Walter, Cleon, and Walter, Cleon, and Duco. By March 16th, the 6 of them were arraigned in Benson, to which they now confessed to 64 crimes that they could recall, so probably more. All of them pled not guilty initially to kidnapping and robbery. The trial was scheduled to begin in Benson on Monday, April 10th. But in a surprise change of events, and with less than 50 people in attendance in the courtroom that Friday, Cleon, Duco, and Walter pled guilty to the robbery charges and were sentenced to 5 to 40 years hard labor at Stillwater Penitentiary. The women pleading guilty to kidnapping were given various sentences in the Women's Reformatory in Shakopee. Mabel was sentenced to no more than 1 year. Blanche was sentenced to no more than 5 years, which is odd because she was probably the most recent addition to the gang. So I don't know if she was more involved with the robbery piece, but in case. And then Margaret was sentenced to no more than 2 years, but Margaret's charge was stayed in lieu of 1 year probation due to her age and the fact that she had just married Cleon a few days before. According to the Monitor, before imposing sentence on 30-year-old mother Mrs. Oliva, Judge Cavale turned to the rest of the defendants and began a short discourse on crime and punishment in its relationship to society. In his opening remarks, he made the statement that was, quote, "This is the first time in his 36 years on the bench that he had had occasion to pass sentence on women for such offense." Mrs. Oliva, who had been sobbing, then fainted to the floor. A few deputies had to revive her, and she came to after 2 minutes, and she was allowed to be seated whilst Judge Cavale passed sentence. And then he did that, and then we're taken back to the Montevideo jail. So, and then just in case you thought they were done with their shenanigans, the gang, or Montevideo Sheriff Peterson thwarted a jailbreak attempt by the men, Walter and Cleon, just hours before the prisoners were supposed to be sent to Stillwater. Peterson had discovered a dozen hacksaw blades and a crudely fashioned key and stopped them from escaping. I don't know how they got their hands on some hacksaw blades, but somehow they did. I'm gonna back up just a little bit to the process to the coroner's inquest, which is, I don't know if they still do that anymore, but they basically just look at the forensic evidence and determine how whoever it is died or was killed. And this took place the day after their final spree, and this was at Hoyland Undertaking Parlor. According to the Swift County Monitor, the coroner's jury returned, quote, that Noble Bonrud, deceased, met his death and died from the effects of a gunshot wound in the act of committing a robbery. His brother Joseph Bonrud was on hand to identify the body. Now if you can think about it, so I did find out that I don't know why Joseph decided to do it, but none of the other relatives were willing to go identify the body. When I found the coroner's inquest papers at the History Museum in St. Paul, there were a couple other tidbits that I learned that were in the transcripts that I didn't know about. According to Carl Tengvall, the blue Buick actually arrived in Benson, drove past Goggins fuel station a few times, and then out to the stockyards, and then back to the station. Not sure why, but they must have been scoping it out type of a thing is what I think. And Arnie Strand showed the sheriff where to hide, which you saw in that previous photo. According to Arnie Strand, the burglars held him at gunpoint and took his money belt and wallet to the sum of about $4, which is about $86 in today's money. As the burglars tried to get away, leaving Noble dead, the car wouldn't start right away. And so they continued to fire shots at the sheriff, but eventually one of them took control of the wheel and backed up so the headlights were on Noble. And then the car drove off. Noble's body was covering the money belt. According to the coroner, he arrived on the scene about 11 p.m. to find Noble lying there, billfold open with about $5 and a box of shells unused. There were also a few watches found on him too. By that time, the sheriff was in possession of a .38 pistol that Noble had also carried. So now flash forward to the funeral for Noble, which took place Thursday, March 2nd, 1933 at Our Savior's in Baxter. According to the Western Guard of Madison, quote, "The funeral of Noble Bonrud, son of the late Mr. and Mrs. Carl Bonrud of Baxter Township, was held in the Baxter Church yesterday afternoon. The guard was printed before the funeral was held, but it is safe to say that hundreds of former neighbors of the Bonruds attended. It will be remembered that about 2 years ago, 3 men with a Wild West urge shot up the streets of Dawson, robbing 2 Dawson business places and a Watson hardware store. These men were Cleon and Noble Bonrud and a man by the name of Sturgeon. For this offense, they were sentenced to St. Cloud and later paroled, promising to leave the state of Minnesota." Now, on a side note, I went under the impression that there was no funeral actually for Noble because I could not find information on it in the church records, the pastor's notes, very little, but I did find an entry eventually. So that he did have a funeral, and I recently learned there was a Facebook post for today's event, and I think it's the granddaughter of the pastor at the time. She had shared that indeed the Western Guard was right, that hundreds of people showed up because they wanted to see how Pastor Froyland was going to treat the funeral, because apparently he was very much a fire and brimstone person. So, but she had also commented and said that he decided to leave the judgment for a higher power that day. So there was a funeral, but it's been pretty much wiped out of the history books, as you could say. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Let's see. Oops. The burial. So this, after the funeral, the next sequence of events here are passed down from first-hand accounts through some of the church members at Our Savior's that have now told it to me, and I'm going to go on the hunch that they're right. But because of his crimes, the pastor did say he wasn't allowed to have a church burial. So I can't even find it in somebody else I had contacted for the pastor's notes, couldn't find anything else in his notes about why he didn't allow it or did, but in any case, whoops, I went past one of them. But according to these accounts, late the night of March 2nd, some folks gathered to hoist the coffin of Noble Bonrud over the fence that outlined the cemetery at Our Savior's because it was locked. The fence is obviously no longer there, as most of you know, and he was buried late that evening in the dark next to other Bonrud relatives. So what would Noble tell you today if he was here? I think he would say that he definitely was a rebel and enjoyed the thrill of holding up gas stations to rob them, but that he was also very young and immature, being 17 at the beginning. Having very little family support, he latched on to his siblings Cleon and Mabel. I think Noble would also have enjoyed the notoriety of being so famous across the Midwest. But I would also like to think that he would have straightened out his life like the other gang members had he not been shot. And just to give you again a little bit more perspective of the notoriety of this, according to the Minnesota Corrections Association, they have like a yearbook of like the top 10 crimes of the decade all the way through Minnesota's time, and in the 30s this ranks towards the top, to give you some sort of perspective of that. So what happened to the rest of the Bonruds? I know I didn't talk about Noble's siblings very much, but I'll just quick breeze through sort of the rest of them. Carrie married Fred Schultz, and they had 3 children, one of which is still alive, Fred Jr. He lives in Cambridge, and I got to see him last summer. He's like, I think 88, but he still had some good information for me. Christina married Jens Ronning, and they had 9 children. Jens was a prominent farmer in the area, and both of them were very involved at Our Savior's. Melvin died at the age of 3 from a brain disorder of some kind. It's obviously not specific. Gilbert never married, and he died from pneumonia and a brain tumor. He was a farm laborer and farmer all of his life. And Joe and Corella, they had 2 children. He was a farmer and a well witcher and a pesticide inspector, I think, for the county. Their descendants live in the Alexandria area, and they were also very involved at the church. Amanda married Clarence Wagner and had 3 daughters. She worked at some restaurant in Monty, and I wish I could find out which one, because apparently she made pies, and my great-grandfather sat down and had some pie and said, "I'm going to marry this lady," supposedly, according to family history, but I don't know what restaurant in Montevideo. Clarence was a blacksmith also. Melvina, she died at the age of 16 from tuberculosis. Dora Bonrud married Jay Dayton, had 4 children, then separated and remarried David Sturland. Jay was a farmer, Dora a telephone operator, and David was a carpenter. Casper Bonrud, he had 3 wives and 3 children, with his second marriage, Isabel Sealer, and he was a laborer all of his life. Mabel, she married Julian Peterson and had a daughter, and then 1 more daughter with a second husband, Duco, who, as I mentioned earlier, was in the gang. 2 of Mabel's grandchildren, they were going to be with us today. There were some extenuating circumstances, but otherwise they would have been here also on hand to answer any questions. Julian worked as a painter, Duco was an electrician, and Mabel was a waitress, and we recently found out also a madam in Minneapolis. Yeah. Elva married Art Burgo and had 4 children. 1 son is still living in the New London Spicer area, and Art worked for the Public Works Department. Cleon, he also went on to have 3 wives, 2 children with his second wife, Lola. Cleon went into the military once he got out of prison and worked in various jobs as a laborer the rest of his life. And you also know what happened to Noble now. So I'll open up to any questions. I'll try to answer what I can. And I also want to say thank you to Barb for inviting me to be here today and the Lac-Qui-Parle Historical Museum. It's been a pleasure to prepare for this. So, does anyone have any questions or anything they want to either add or share or ask? Yep.
About when would Joe Bonrud have been born?
It would have been late 1800s.
Late 1800s.
I could tell you here if you give me a second.
You're not so old, Bob, that you would have known him. Is that right?
1892, and he lived till 1967.
See, he lived, I lived 2 miles north of the Baptist church when I grew up, that's right.
Oh, okay.
And he lived 1 mile north of us. I know
Okay.
exactly where he lived.
Oh,
I've
okay.
seen his names being a pallbearer for
Yep.
various
Correct.
people
Yep.
from that church.
That's correct. Yep, he was.
What was his wife's name, do you remember?
Corella Mork. She went by Anna most of the time, but Corella.
What did you say first?
Corella Mork.
Corella.
Yep.
Joe and Corella.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I met the guy, I mean, you know, I was a young kid at that time, but,
Sure.
well, not too young. But, I know who he was, and I know where
Okay.
he lived.
Okay. I'll have to follow up with you here when we get
Yeah,
done.
sure.
So I can double check my facts on
There's-
his farm.
I don't think there's any buildings left on the place now, but I know where the road, driveway went up the hill.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I'll definitely have to ask you, because maybe the farm I thought was his isn't his, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I know where he lived anyway.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions or, yes?
I'm from Boyd, and
Okay.
my grandfather had a general store in Boyd about that time, and it
Okay.
was burglarized, and the burglars were suspected of being some Bonruds.
Probably were. Yep.
Anyway, we've just gotten in a new supply of merchandise,
Oh,
And they
no.
took most of it. I guess they almost busted my grandfather
Oh,
with
no.
merchandise they took from his store,
Wow. That's
What was the
something.
name of the store?
Eckhart's.
Eckhart's.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing that. Anyone else?
Which
Oh.
Bonrud married a running?
Christina. She married Jen's Ronning.
Was it east of Baxter Church a couple miles and then south?
I don't know where they farmed, to be honest.
There was a running farm east and on 212.
There's a good
then
chance.
south in that county road, and
Okay.
I knew one of the runnings.
Okay, okay.
His mother was supposed to have been a Bonrud.
Yep, yep,
That would be.
yep. Anything else or questions? Yeah,
You know, until Fred mentioned that, did they take items? It seems like they mostly took money.
mostly took money.
Okay.
In my research, they had taken some things on occasion, usually beer,
Right.
but possibly other things, but yes. Primarily they went after the money, so
And what did they do with it then? They just spent it or?
they just spent it. Yep. Buy more beer and gasoline probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
What?
I wanna add something.
Oh, okay, go for it.
Alright,
That's fine.
I'm his mother, go for it. Mabel, when we were growing up, my sister's 3 years younger than I, and my sister idolized Mabel because she was such a fashion person. Her hair was always immaculate, her makeup, her fingernails, and we burst her bubble terrible of her memories of Aunt Mabel when we told her she was a madam. That she idolized a madam growing up.
The two granddaughters that we'd mentioned of Mabel's that were going to be here today, we had coffee with them a few months ago, and they told us that. We actually didn't know that she was a madam as well in Minneapolis. But where's it going with that? Oh, they are related to is it cousins or siblings? No, cousins of Ken Halverson, who wrote you might be familiar with the two books of my grandma's, what is it? Grandma's in Heaven and something else. Yeah. So those books are, just so you know, if you come across them, they are entertaining, but Kenny very much embellished and dramatized things. So those books are not a good source for actual factual information, just so you know. Even the rest of his family have said that, so.
Yeah.
Just so you know. Anything else?
So is that the address, Nicolina, Bonrud, Watson?
Yep, Watson, Chippewa County, yep.
North America.
Yep, they came up, she came in on the train. She's a niece of Gunder Bonrud. And I don't know why, I don't know a whole lot about her. She came over when she was 26 by herself, from what I can see in the immigration and ship manifests. She came over for some reason, and then I assume stayed with Carl and Tilly, but I'm not sure. And then she passed away just a short 3 years later. She missed both censuses, so it's hard for me to get a whole lot of information on her, but yeah. So, well, thank you very much for coming. You can certainly take the handouts with you if you want. Again, thanks to Barb and the Historical Museum for having this, and I don't know if you have anything more to say or add.
Well, thank you for doing the program. I'm sure there'll be people